One example of an object with springs are trampolines. Trampolines need springs, and without them it would be useless. When someone bounces on a trampoline and it stretches the springs, it also increases the amplitude of the graph. The rate that the spring goes in and out is the period, which is also inversely related to the frequency. As the spring keeps on condensing and stretching at the rate of the period, it will keep going until the springs will eventually reach equilibrium and it will stop. If the amplitude wasn't able to increase, then there would be no use of the trampoline because it wouldn't be able to bounce. The period's important to the trampoline because they help to control it. It's important to understand how amplitude, frequency, and period affect trampolines because it can affect the safety of the product, how the springs will last with the constant straining and stretching that it has to undergo, as well as how high that you will be able to bounce. The second example of an object with springs is a spring mattress. It's important to be aware that the amplitude of the springs that you put in the mattress, because it can affect how much the springs will condense under a person's weight. The period, frequency, and amplitude are all factors that will determine if the springs in the bed will form a soft or firm bed. You will need to make sure that all the springs are about the same size because if they aren't, the bed will be uneven and cause backaches. The period will help to control the speed of the bounce, and you don't want it to bounce really quickly because then it will be uncomfortable. You want it to be slower and relaxing. Another object with springs is an retractable pen. The springs in a retractable pen are very necessary, and it helps the pen to be functional. Retractable pens have two springs, one at the top and one at the bottom, and amplitude is one of the most important factors here. You want your amplitude to be large enough that the point of the pen is able to be pushed out. However, you don't want it to be so large that the pen will just go back in and then you won't be able to write. It's important to understand that there will be force and pressure applied to the point, and the spring needs to be able to put up some resistance so the pen will be effective and able to write. You also want there to be a smaller frequency and period because that means that the pen can quickly go from having the point in to having the point out. Another example of an object with springs is a car. Cars use something called shocks, which are large springs that help to absorb the impact when a car drives over a bumpy surface. The goal of the spring is to reduce the amplitude. The larger the bump, the larger the amplitude will be. A larger car will bounce and move less when going over a bump because it is larger and more stable, and it can have less stiff of a spring. A smaller car, however, is going to need a stiffer spring because when it drives over a bump, it's going to bounce and move a lot. So a stiffer spring will help to absorb the shock more. The period and frequency will be the amount of time it takes for the movement to stop and come to initial position. If you're able to understand the period, frequency, and amplitude, you're able to create springs that are able to absorb the shock and create a safe and comfortable car ride. The last example I have for you is a Nerf gun. So it's really important to understand how the frequency, amplitude, and period affect a Nerf gun. For example, the amplitude can really impact the amount of force that the bullets will come out at. If there isn't enough amplitude or force, then the bullets won't be able to be fired. However, if there's a lot of amplitude or force exerted onto the bullets, then it can become dangerous and has the power to potentially injure or harm somebody. The period and frequency are important because they can influence how long it takes for the bullet to be launched out of the gun. It needs to be pretty quick, especially if you're going to compete with a friend. If it's slow, it's going to leave you at a disadvantage. If you aren't able to see how amplitude, period, and frequency affect a Nerf gun, then it could result in jamming the gun or even a misfire. As you can see, springs are literally everywhere, and learning to graph sine and cosine graphs actually do have a real-world application, and understanding things like period, amplitude, frequency are really useful And if you don't understand them, then we may not have some of the products we have today. So it's really eye-opening to realize just how many things use math in our lives without us even thinking about it. So I really enjoyed this project because it really let me see the applications of the knowledge that I was learning.